is such an honor for the three of us to be presenting to you all today, particularly because of how much we respect the group, but also its new leader, and also the occasion to talk on Überveillance, which we haven't done very often quite recently, I don't think. The way that today's seminar will run is that Michael will give an introductory definition on his term Überveillance. I'll then look at Überveillance in practice, and then Roba will complete by critiquing Überveillance from her lens. So Michael, you might want to start.
Thank you for being with us, and thank you very much, Joe, and thank you to all our friends for being here. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. I'm delighted and I'm privileged to be here. So I'm MG Michael, and I'd like to welcome you to the first part of our presentation. Überveillance can be defined as an omnipresent electronic surveillance facilitated by technology that makes it possible to embed surveillance devices into the human body. These embedded technologies can take the form of traditional pacemakers, RFID tag and transponder implants, smart swallowable pills, nanotechnology patches, multi-electrode array brain implants, and even smart dust, and this is only to mention but a few form factors. Überveillance has to do with the fundamental who, someone's identity, where, someone's location, and when, i.e. timestamps, in an attempt to derive motivation, what, the result, and even the how, the method, the plan, and increasingly the thought. Überveillance can be a predictive mechanism for a person's expected behavior, traits, likes or dislikes, based on historical fact, or it can be about real-time measurement and observation, or it can be something in between. The inherent problem with Überveillance is that facts do not always add up to truth, as contradictory as that might sound. And predictions or interpretations based on Überveillance are not always correct, even if there is direct visual evidence available. In a longer presentation, I would have defended that statement by making reference to context, which is invisible to the naked eye. So Überveillance cannot know the soul, so it will become increasingly aggressive and intrusive. Überveillance is more than CCTV feeds or cross-agency databases linked to national identity cards or biometrics and e-passports used for international travel. Überveillance is the sum total, it's the summa of all these types of surveillance and the deliberate integration of individuals' personal data for the continuous tracking and monitoring of identity, location, and point of view in real time. In its ultimate form, Überveillance has to do with more than automatic identification and location-based technologies that we carry with us. It has to do with an under-the-skin technology that is embedded in the body, such as microchip implants. And of course, that technology is continually evolving. Think of it as Big Brother on the inside looking out. It is like a black box embedded in the body, which records and gathers evidence. And in this instance, transmitting specific measures wirelessly back to base. This implant is virtually meaningless without the hybrid network architecture that supports its functionality, making the person a walking online node. We are referring here to the lowest common denominator in the definition, the smallest unit of tracking, presently a tiny chip inside the body of a human being or an animal or a thing. But it should be stated that electronic tattoos and nano patches that are worn on the body can also certainly be considered mechanisms for data collection in the future. Whether wearable or bearable or even insertable, it is the intent and objective which remains important. It's the notion of people as sensors. The gradual emergence of the so-called human cloud, that cloud computing platform which allows for the interworking of human points of view using wearable recording technology, will also be a major factor in the proactive profiling of individuals. Dataveillance, conceived by Roger Clark of the Australian National University in 1988, is the systematic use of personal data systems in the investigation or monitoring of the actions or communications of one or more persons. And according to the Oxford Dictionary, dataveillance is summarized as the practice of monitoring the online activity of a person or a group. It is hard to believe that this term, dataveillance, was introduced a quarter of a century ago in response to our government's agency, to government agency here in Australia that sought to data match initiatives linking taxation records and social security benefits, among other commercial data mining practices. At the time, it was a powerful statement in response to the Australia Card proposal in 1987, which was never implemented, despite attempts to introduce an access card almost 2 decades later in 2005. The same issues ensue today, only on a more momentous magnitude, with far more consequences and advanced capabilities in analytics, data storage, and converging systems. The implications are extremely more severe given the ubiquity of these surveillance technologies. Surveillance, conceived by Steve Mann of the University of Toronto in 2002, but practiced since at least 1995, is the recording of an activity from the perspective of a participant in that activity. However, its initial introduction into the literature came in the inaugural publication of the Surveillance and Society Journal in 2003, with a meaning of inverse surveillance as a counter to organizational surveillance. Steve Mann prefers to interpret surveillance as undersight, which maintains integrity, contra to surveillance as oversight, which equates to hypocrisy, and where there is not an equal relationship between the observer and the observed. Whereas dataveillance is the systematic use of personal data systems in monitoring people, surveillance is the inverse of monitoring people. It is a continuous capture of personal experience. For example, dataveillance might include the linking of someone's tax file number with their bank account details and communications data. Surveillance, on the other hand, is a voluntary act of logging, even logging one's own life continually, with what one might see around them as they move through the world. Of course, that raises other privacy implications. To what extent do I want to be involved in another's life logging experiment or collection or biography? So all these implications that arise from these intrusive surveillance technologies. Surveillance is thus considered watching from above, whereas surveillance is considered watching from below. In contrast, dataveillance is the monitoring of a person's online activities, which presents the individual with numerous social dangers. I conceived of Überveillance in a postgraduate class I delivered at the University of Wollongong in 2006. Today, and I did this after being prompted by my marvelous students to describe what I felt was happening with these intrusive surveillance technologies. And I could not think of a term or a word that adequately expressed what I was feeling or seeing. Big Brother didn't quite cut it for me. I wanted something that internalized the surveillance, and Überveillance came to my mind, which had a history in my thinking going back to literature, to philosophy, and my reading of apocalyptic literature. And I've documented all that in other papers if you're interested. So there was certainly a background to how the term dropped in that day, a whole history. So today it is commonly defined as ubiquitous or pervasive electronic surveillance that is not only always on, but always with you, ultimately in the form of bodily invasive surveillance. The term itself entered the Macquarie Dictionary of Australia officially in 2008. And I was happy to see very close to how I had originally defined it. So I was happy with the result here. So it's defined as an omnipresent electronic surveillance facilitated by technology that makes it possible to embed surveillance devices in the human body. I was particularly happy that the definition allowed for some elasticity to the definition, allowing for new innovations and new technologies which were aligned or married to surveillance technology. The concern over Überveillance is directly related to the misinformation, misinterpretation, and information manipulation of citizens' data. That is, we can strive for omnipresence through real-time remote sharing and monitoring, but we will never and can never achieve simple omniscience. And this is why these technologies will become more aggressive as they try to reach that divinity, if I can call it that, but it just can't happen because that would mean depth charging into the soul. And that's why I made that distinction between truth and facts and the importance of context. Überveillance is a compound word conjoining the German über, meaning over or above, French valence, which more literally translated means is watchfulness. The concept is very much linked to Nietzsche's vision of the Übermensch, who is a man with powers beyond those of an ordinary human being, like a Superman with amplified abilities. And this is how we are hoping to evolve our technology, to make it a super technology with amplified abilities. So my connection with Nietzsche's Übermensch is a closely linked one. So Überveillance is analogous to, the irony there, of course, in the definition is that Überveillance itself wants to present itself as an omniscient device, an omniscient system, but it carries within it the inherent contradictions that it can be manipulated by various agents to create the misinformation, the misinterpretation, and information manipulation. So there is a fallacy and there is a false comfort in this technology. Perhaps you may call it fake news. That's we can look at it in that context. So the more we think we have an infallible source, the more we can manipulate it to make people think actually the information we're given is infallible. But the truth is it can be greatly manipulated and used in ways which the information was never intended. So Überveillance is analogous to embedded devices that quantify the self and measure indiscriminately. For example, heart, pulse, and temperature, sensor readings emanating from the body in binary bits wirelessly, or even through amplified eyes, such as inserted contact lens glass that might provide visual display and access to the internet or social networking applications. Überveillance brings together all forms of watching from above and from below, from machines that move to those that stand still, from animals and from people, acquired involuntarily or voluntarily, using obtrusive or unobtrusive devices. The smaller the surveillance device, the more dangerous or the more amplified its use can be, and eroding even further our want, our need, the importance of privacy. And sometimes because we can't see it, we think it cannot affect us. Another irony in that. The network infrastructure underlies the ability to collect big data analytics and ensures an interpretation of the unique behavioral traits of the individual, implying more than just predicted movement, but trying to imply or to suggest intent and thought. It has been said that Überveillance is that part of the valence puzzle that brings together the Sur, the data, and the Sul, to an intersecting point. In Überveillance, there is the watching from above component, so there is the collecting of personal data and public data for mining data, and there is the watching from below, so, which can draw together social networks, strangers, all coming together via wearable and implantable devices on or in the human body. Überveillance can be used for good, but we contend that independent of its application for non-medical purposes, it will always have an underlying control factor of power and authority. And these are the questions, the implications that define our work and our research to try to come to some sort of understanding of how we can be used, what are the dangers, and how we can publicly share and analyze these dangers for the public and with our colleagues. So I now turn you over to Katina and my lifelong collaborator and Roba, one of our inspirations and one of my finest and most incredible of students. And so I'm very proud today.
Thank you, Michael, for that beginning and the definition. I'm going to tell a story, a little bit different to Michael, who defined Überveillance. So mine's a story, and I met Michael in 1992, and we got married in 1994. I was at the end of my first year at university when Michael and I married. So you could say we've been formally researching together for 20 years, but actually more like probably 26, if not 28. So I knew of Michael when I was 16. And I had this interest in the social implications of technology. I was a very good computing student at the time in high school, and I was fascinated by technology, absolutely fascinated. Always wanted to be an early adopter, convinced the teachers to let me take home software and the computers in the lab. I also like to borrow lots of books, books that Michael had introduced me to from a theology background. And I read a lot of those tomes as well and enjoyed reading those things, which opened my eyes to a lot of magical works in the early church fathers. In 1994, as I said, I was in first year university and got to work with some wonderful people at UTS. Probably the best person I worked with was in my final year of study, Professor Jennifer Edwards. And Jenny really let me loose. I said, Jenny, I want to do a research sort of project on government identifiers and the microchipping of human beings. And in her very, very much pure computer science way, said, oh yeah, whatever you want, Kat, you can do it. So I would see her once a week, drive 1.5 hours to see her, and we would sit in her office. She was a professor, quite young, and just talk about the topic. Very encouraging. And that degree had 2 cooperative semesters, one of them at Otis Elevator Company, the other one at Anderson Consulting. And while I was finishing my project, I was also at Anderson Consulting, and I was allowed to use the corporate library, which was a wonderful, wonderful transnational library, most of it in print, but a lot of it accessed online as well. And I came across a piece. The librarian was very helpful. I explained to her what my thesis was about, and she came back with something. And that something was called the human metaphor. And I believe on the pages that I photocopied, painstakingly, I must have spent days photocopying things like information on automatic teller machines and point of sale and all of these other things. I came across the human metaphor. And in my mind, the depiction was of something that you see below in the screen there. It was a human being with their hands on a table with a cathode road tube on their head. And I remember going home to Michael and saying, Michael, you would never believe what I just read today and what I saw. It's exactly what you've been talking about. But lo and behold, Überveillance in concept was an old thing, I think, that Michael had in his heart, but had not been articulated. And never did we think, Michael being a theologian and philosopher, did we ever think we'd actually end up researching together? And we did, which was magical, actually, around 2003. We just never thought computer science, and then later myself in law, and then Michael in philosophy, history, theology, counseling, and so many other sort of literature, government. We never thought we'd actually end up working together, but we did. And we got to teach many classes together, which was a joy. And we actually even got to lecture some on occasion together. But by the end of my degree, I ended up becoming employed by a company called Nortel, Northern Telecom, the first company to build PABXs in the world. And to cut a long story short, I left Sydney with many job offers, and we moved down to the Illawarra together. And I never was looking for work. But one weekend, I was with my father-in-law in Sydney. We were up visiting, and he always loved the Sydney Morning Herald. And I turned to the second page, and there was this big spread saying network planner, network planners needed, whatever that was. And it said University of Wollongong. And I thought, this can't be right. Like the place where I'm doing my master's at the time would also be my place of work.
You mean your PhD?
Well, I upgraded. So I started in a master's by research and then upgraded halfway through that in 1998 to finish the PhD. So there I was working for a multinational company. I was doing research on implantables. And I went to my tote tray in 1998 because back then the company had newspapers in print. They were about 35 to 40 pages in size. And on the back page, I had let it fester there on my desk for a few weeks. And then on the back page, I just turned, as you do, to the back, and I saw Cyborg 1.0, Nortel sponsors this project. And I had heard around the traps that the humble phone that we produced at the time was quite a nice phone, actually, compared to the bricks that were around in 1998, would become obsolete. And they were already talking to us about brain-to-brain interfaces, that this was already obsolete technology, despite that Nortel had one of the trendiest kinds of mobile phones. So there I was at Anderson Consulting. I get hit with this human metaphor. I turn up to like my first couple of years at Nortel, where I'm building networks across the world, really, predominantly in Asia, but also elsewhere, cutting edge stuff on storage area networks. And on the back page is my company sponsoring a guy, a professor from the University of Reading, a cyberneticist who wants to implant himself in an experiment, who ends up becoming a lifelong friend, Kevin Warwick. So this is actually the photocopy. Last night, I didn't sleep. I wanted to find the photocopies. And I've digitized most of my materials, but this is what it looked like. So imagine I think I was 20 years old. We had been married not even 2 years, 3 years. And we had been talking a lot about our work, of course, and our studies, but the human metaphor moving to the end of technology. Think about that. And then the trends were this. There is only one important trend, the human metaphor, the drive to eliminate the human-computer interface, HCI. And then I kept reading on. The metaphor for the computer will be the human being. Hang on a second. The metaphor for the computer will be the human being. What? I think that's a bit like the H+ transhumanist kinds of definitions. Human to computer communications as natural as human to human communications. And the end of the computer interface. That means we become the Borg. We assimilate. We somehow coalesce with a machine. Meanwhile, I'm studying implantables for my PhD. And at that time, I was working in my last year of university, ready to matriculate to go into permanent work. So we started with batch systems in the 60s, went online in the 70s, had database management system integration in the 80s, and then they called the 1990s, which is what I was living in when I was at this workplace, the new age. And the new age was the human-computer metaphor, the elimination of the requirement for HCI, the natural interaction with machines, as if we weren't talking to machines, we were one with machines. And I think this concept we had talked about as the electrophorus together, which was published in my thesis, but I can say that Michael had a big deal to have with that definition and its exploration. And so there was the man with the cathode road tube. It's actually an iMac. I also worked in work experience for Apple Mac in the city when I was in grade 10. But you can see this woman is talking to this man, but the man has, an iMac on his head, And she's like, everything's normal. Like everything is normal. This is the new age system. Now, whether this is a metaphor or the people who created this actually believed we will become one with a machine, I'm not sure. But the implications were identified. The end of the computer interface, technology so sophisticated it cannot be seen. Okay, so there's that ubiquity, there's that this invisibility, this unobtrusiveness, this covertness, this one with, this ambience, this ambient intelligence. And so then the stories get deeper and deeper. Eduardo Katz creates in 1997 a bioartistry where he implants himself and puts something in his leg. You can see the implant there. It's a transponder that Michael was describing before. And he proceeds to register himself on a pet database. And he claims in his work, which you can find online still today, that it's not that phones are extensions of humans, but we are extensions of the machines. That's what he claims. And so there I am working, creating networks across Asia, huge wide area networks, using mapping intelligence information, using know-how of our systems at Nortel, and working with people in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in India, in Taiwan, and many of these places I got to visit, the Philippines. They were all deregulating. And so we were just milking, if I could say at the time, the ability to share infrastructure with regards to bandwidth. Everyone wanted more bandwidth. This was the time, at this time that I was working there, we're talking about 14 kilobits per second speed. And then there were hints of the 1 meg modem, and then wireless and wireless broadband. And then we went from 2G to 3G, and then we were auctioning off, while I was still there in 2002, auctioning off 3G network space and spectrum across Australia, for example. And here's that infamous, so that was 97, 98 right here. And you can see on the back page here, October 1998, there's that article, and there were many subsequent articles. I just can't find them. So it says here, Kevin Warwick, head of the cybernetics department at the University of Reading, recently spent several days as the world's first cyborg. Warwick, an expert on robotics and intelligent buildings, had a tiny glass capsule containing an electromagnetic coil and several silicon chips capable of transmitting a 64-bit signal surgically implanted in his arm. His secretary commented, it was often hard to find Professor Warwick, but since the implant, we always know where he is. That's because they rigged up the hallways with RFID readers. Warwick told Nortel World his goal is to connect to the nervous system next and ultimately use thought processes to operate computers. In fact, the company took that as possible and sponsored one of Kevin Warwick's students, Mark Gasson, who you saw at the beginning of the PowerPoint slide. So there's Professor Kevin Warwick undergoing his first procedure. He only kept the implant in for 10 days. This is Dr. George Boulos, who agreed to do the operation. We then had this wonderful CEO who both raised us and sunk us, but you can see here the share price. If we think Google was big, at the time I was at Nortel, I think I was receiving hundreds of shares in lieu of my work, and the share price was rising from when I joined to, from say $10 or $4, we're talking now 100 plus. This was unheard of around the time of the dot-com crash. This is what we describe as the dot-com crash, but many of the organizations were happy in purchasing companies. And I talk about this.
I think you should mention, consequently, the shares meant nothing.
They meant nothing.
Yeah, right.
We'll talk about that in a moment.
Right,
This is the thing.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
That while they were busy, we bought Shasta Networks for 340 million, and this is now 2000, right? It's not 340 million in 2020. So these are commensurately worth billions. Qterra, a fiber optic regenerator company, 3.25 billion, et cetera, not to go on the sums. But as we grew quickly, we bought out a lot of infrastructure and a lot of competitors. We merged with competitors, and we had a lot of superfluous product, which sent the company into a spin. So on the one hand, buying, we increased our workforce from 30,000 people to 130,000, which is where sort of your typical Google is at today. But we did that back in 2000, and then the big crash. But their eyes were not on innovations to do with pick up the telephone and have a voice call on a 64 kilobit line. No, they were thinking brain to brain. John Roth would often write to his employees directly, one of these charismatic CEOs who would reach out transnationally to 150 countries and basically say, look, this is my vision. We're doing a right angle turn. Everything's going to be IP. Everything's going to be data. And so while I'm working at Nortel and enrolled in my PhD, it's 2001 by now, and I read about this digital angel thing. This wireless service transmits medical information from patient to doctor. And AT&T, which is the big incumbent operator, like Telstra in the States, says we're going to go for it, AT&T Wireless. And at that time in 2002, Kevin goes one step further and does Cyborg 2.0. This is wife Irina, and wife Irina has an implant, and Kevin places an electrode into the median nerve, and as he's clenching his fist or moving his thumb and forefinger, he's starting to do things remotely. His wife believes that she felt Morse code coming through in a blind test case in the laboratory at Kevin's lab. And there were many observers there. I've met both of them. I've had dinner with both of them. And they seem very interesting people with regards to where robotics will go into the future and how humans will utilize technologies embedded in the body. But back to the digital angel now. So all of these things are happening. I'm telling you this story chronologically. So the digital angel introduces the ability to allow someone that you love to be watched and location tracked in case they may have dementia and are wandering. The system works by you wearing a watch at first, then Digital Angel changed to be an implantable device. But if the wearer has an ambient temperature alert, an emergency fall down alert, or a wander alert outside a geofence boundary, a cell tower is notified that the person is out of bounds or has had a forced hit on the ground. The operations center is notified, the caregiver is notified by the operations center, and someone can come to the aid of the individual. 2002, I want to put you in perspective. WAP was around in 2002, the wireless access protocol on the phones. It was like 1.5G, not even fully 2G. And they were thinking about digital angels at the time. But of course, I was working for a networks company. So all of this seemed quite logical to me as I studied at my workplace, both GSM and then later UMTS protocols. And then, as we saw, beyond those, intelligence services. Let's have a look at what was happening in the patent world. And I know, Joe Carvalko, you'll be interested. But in 2002, patents were being identified for transponder implants, a passive integrated transponder called a PIT tag, interestingly enough, comprising an integrated circuit and a unitary core is described furthermore in the patent. We then saw Verichip come out and fully say, we can identify, we can locate, and we can protect. Few people believe that RFID implants for people were actually available around 2002, 2003, 2004. In fact, Applied Digital Solutions was on the New York Stock Exchange around about 2004. And many people can't even conceive that implantables were around before even 2G mobiles were around, right? But such was the core. And if I show you this snap, and I'm very glad I took these snaps, you can go to the Wayback Machine on archive.org and also find these kinds of prints. But I took these during the writing of my thesis. There was the Get Chip campaign. This is the transponder on the left. We now have tags as different form factors, but they said $50 off to all ADSX stockholders of record will receive a $50 discount at the time of chipping, or the first 100,000 registrants. This is how many people they thought would just mop up and attend and adopt in order to get some savings. And so this is a small commercial that I want to share with you, only 30 seconds, so that you can see the kinds of things that were being conceived in the early 2000s.
To think something so small can connect you to everything that matters.
When your life and all you love are on the line.
HealthLink is always with you when every second counts in the emergency room, providing immediate access to your medical records.
Because Bob has trouble remembering all his medications.
Because I'm in love with my kids' kids.
Because my car lost control while driving.
Because now I'm looking out for both of us. because I have diabetes, but it doesn't have me.
Because I spend my life in the ER trying to save yours.
So friends, Applied Digital Solutions morphed into Very Cheap. Very Cheap diversified into 4 areas, according to their website at the time. You can't find that website apart from the Wayback Machine today. They had the VeryPay. They were thinking about implantable solutions for payment instead of using a card. The VeryGuard, physical access control to premises. Correctional services, so basically to implant inmates, perhaps individuals serving their sentence from home, instead of using an anklet bracelet. And the VeryMed, this doctor to nurse to patient kind of transference using implantables. And the VeryMed would act as a personal health record, a PHR. And that PHR would store things like your allergies, would store your current doses of drugs, and would store any condition that you may have had. For example, if you were an anaphylactic. This is Jeff and Derek and Leslie Jacobs. Jeff suffered from Huntington disease. Wife Leslie was fine, and young man Derek was Microsoft certified by the age of 13 or 14. He loved technology, and this is the scanner that was used at the time. The VeryChip was ordered or recommended to be placed on the right tricep, but not everyone agreed to that. But the definitions in the company's papers were actually about the right tricep, which later many users said was, impossible to actually flex your arm. It was much handier to be in the hand itself because you could reach out rather than try to wiggle your arm or shoulder towards a reader, especially a reader that was fixed and not mobile. So this is actually the VeryChip reader. It's a mobile device. 900 hospitals had invested in the device. Ambulances were supposed to stock them for those 900 hospitals that had registered on the schema, because when they reached a patient, and if the patient was incapacitated, the reader device would be scanned on the right tricep where the implant was to be assumed had been implanted, and would tell the individual and link up allegedly. But you need people to adopt, you need readers to become distributed and out there. The young man actually deceased in a motorbike accident, young Derek Jacobs, which was a shock to most people, as he was very much promoted in this implantable ideal. Baja Beach Club then, a chain of a Baja Beach Club chain in Rotterdam, in Barcelona, and also one in America, adopted the Applied Digital Solution mobile reader. Here we can see the person being scanned in. I met the gentleman, Serafim Villaplana, in Barcelona in 2009. I actually went in here. These are my photos. And it was a really strange feeling to actually go into that nightclub. Serafim, who was not a university trained, created a database and a payment system so that VIP customers, and there were around about purportedly 200 to 300 VIP customers, some say 400. They didn't really keep tabs, but you could load some money onto the implant and then go into different VIP zones as you frequented the beach. And the whole idea was, while you were partying and not wearing very much, in Barcelona, they usually wear their swimsuits in these kinds of establishments. You could go from the beach into the cafe, into the restaurant, into the VIP zone, into the drinking zone, and so forth, and come in and out without needing to carry keys, without needing to carry money. That was the whole idea. And when you looked at the guidebook, one of the guidebooks had, you must go and visit Baja Beach Club. And interestingly enough, I didn't seek out this club. I was at a conference, in a women in engineering conference, just having left Mark Gasson and Kevin Warwick in England at another conference on identity systems. And someone on the bus who was taking care of the delegates heard me talking about my research to someone next to me and said, "Oh, my best friend's boyfriend is the guy you're talking about." And it's like, "What?" She goes, "When are you leaving? I can organize an interview." I said, "What?" And of course, me with my suitcases, there are other photos of me. Literally, I felt like I was descending the pits of hell. It was very interesting because they were making up Baja. It was going to be called the Opium Club. But it was a very strange feeling, thinking I've got my luggage and I'm probably never going to get out of here. But no, the gentlemen downstairs in the pit, we went to a physical strong room, were very welcoming. I had a translator with me from the Spanish, and we spoke deeply about this. And he said it was a gimmick, although his reasoning was in the future, most of us would be carrying implants. Then I come into contact with a gentleman, citywatcher.com. Michael and I were at school, probably at university. You had probably finished a lecture with that class. And I get a call out of the blue in 2009 by Mr. Gary Rutherford, who has remained a lifelong friend, a consultant who worked for Applied Digital Solutions, who was installing implantables because the guy he was working for, Sean Darks, kept losing his card. And so he said to Sean, I know what we can do. We can introduce implants into this video surveillance for the city of Ohio and Cincinnati locale. And actually Sean Darks got an implant, and you can see he's now using his forearm, not even his tricep at this stage. And as we see this time, it's gradually going from the tricep down to the forearm to the thumb and webbing of the thumb and forefinger. And there's the strong room that had physical access control. Only a few people were allowed to go in there because there was sensitive information. But at one stage, they actually thought they would need that many buses, that the buses would become mobile chipping vans, that people would be walking up at the side street and saying, I've got diabetes, I want a VeriChip because it's a great idea as a personal health record. They also thought, and the first place they did this, for those who are listening from Maryland, was around the Maryland area. We then started to see an underground emergence of the tag, these biohackers. I remember seeing this from my office at Nortel Networks one lunchtime when I was doing some research for university. And there were a group of members, and we're talking now in the hundreds, who were sharing things. This is 2005, who were sharing about their biohacks, what they got to do with their latest devices. And I saw a gentleman here by the name of Emil. And I reached out to Emil and interviewed Emil. So all of these people in this order, in this sequence, this beautiful sequence, and this one happenstance after another. Here, Emil is interviewed by IEEE Spectrum, and lo and behold, many of you met Christine Paraxlis last week. She wrote a paper with the late Robert Walk on implantables, one of the first surveys launched, I would say the first survey launched on national security and implantables in the US. And she got to critique the article along with others and myself. So it was very interesting, our introduction to Emil, and then I ran a full-length interview with Emil. We also co-authored many papers together, and he also came to ISTAS 2010 to talk about his biohacking. He's now the entrepreneur of DangerousThings.com. But again, going back to the patents, 2007 now, skin marking for indicating subdermal chips. So you might have an implant, but how does somebody else know you've got an implant? So there was a patent to identify implants. There were different visualizations of implantables or wearables, but mainly implantables using RFID, of how you would interact with your house and a wide area network. So if you wanted ambient intelligence, how could you do that successfully? And you can look up these patents now, they're available. And here we are, three of these gentlemen, or two of them in this picture, Emil himself and Mark Gasson with the implants, Professor Rafael Capura, the ethicist who came from Germany to describe Überveillance for us in his own words and describe the perils. He was also part of the European Commission on ICT implants, and Roger Clark, of course, the author of Dataveillance, and he was our conference chair, Michael. But with all of these inventions and innovations, the practice actually infiltrates into society. If I said to you, I received one of these every second day, these are emails from people who believe they've been implanted forcibly. This person says, I'm investigating the unsolicited use of ICT technology. I have an implant myself with controllers being idiotic, including damaging and communicating. Can I ask you about your ICT implants research, please? I'm looking for doctors and possibly a lawyer to deal with the unsolicited use of ICT technology in Australia. Do you have any connections in this regard who are able to talk, to discuss in this regard? Now, I could show you literally over 100 that I've saved, and I've not been careful to save the early ones, but there is a crisis at the moment of people believing they have been implanted against their will. In fact, some individuals have even taken to neuroscience degrees while they believe they've been forcibly implanted. Laws were introduced in the States for identification devices and subcutaneous implanting. And there are many different states. I won't hover on each one of these. I'll make these slides available through Joe. but you can see a comparison done by one of our research students in that class of Michaels, comparing California, Colorado, Florida, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, and so forth, and who had the right or who didn't have the right to implant, what were some of the fines being stipulated in those bills and laws, and how many consecutive days would those fines be executed for. Again, more patents. Patents for GPS implants, and this is something new we haven't heard of before, right? Around 2010. So really GPS doesn't work well because of the blood and water barrier in the body and the skin. But now we're starting to look at innovations where GPS implants are being embraced. Location-based GPS implants. Then companies like Autodesk experimenting with tap sensors and tactile buttons and implantables of a different nature, not so much to read your physical characteristics, but to allow you to input something beneath the skin. We've seen other patents from outside the US talk about microchipping humans and animals using GPS, for example. Another design here from another patent, and all of these are sourced in the notes. You'll see hundreds of these. So every time someone conceives of an idea for a body area network, they're conceiving of an RFID device or an NFC device, either worn, inserted, or implanted into the human being. And so the creation of the body area network standard by IEEE was around about 2011. So we're seeing this progression over time, the creation of the transponder, the demonstration that it does work, the growth of the mobile broadband network infrastructure, the potential for a standard on the human body, and then the interaction between all of these different components in a network, an end-to-end network. And so then we have NIST coming on board saying, yeah, we better be privy about this band thing, this body area network thing, because different countries have different frequencies where they embrace different standards, whether it's the mixed standards, the WMTS, the ISM, the ultra wideband in their megahertz ranges. And so in 2011, there were discussions even about the propagation delay. If we placed a device, a hub device, into the human body, where should it be based to allow for the least amount of backscatter so signal strength could be strong and captured? But the tummy is not the best place, actually. So in 2012, we gave a TEDx talk. We looked at the timeline to that day and then progressed further. Where are we going? Is it going to be not just iTunes and iPods and iLife and iPads? Is it going to be an iPlant? And most likely in 2013, where Joe was present, Christine Paraxis, and so many more, we talked about the wearables going through their phases from phase 1 to phase 2 and generation from generation, way beyond Google Glass. Steve Mann had created the iTap device that even had depth perception many years before Google Glass. And then we had even companies like Medtronic saying, well, why consider implants for sick people? Everyone should have one of these sensors. It's the size of a AAA battery. This could save your life. And IEEE Spectrum ran a story on that. We then had Andreas Sjöström from Sweden, who's now in San Francisco. He spoke at our ISTAS last week and called microchip implants a pretty bad idea, although that didn't stop him from testing the idea for an air flight between Stockholm and Paris. And it did work. You know, he put his hand against the reader, he boarded the flight. It was a bit of a mimic and a gimmick, but he had a lot of things to say about what kind of problem do implants solve. And he said, it doesn't really solve a real problem. It doesn't really work well. Sometimes you need to scan multiple times. Depending on the implantable, sometimes if you didn't carry a biobond, the implant would also go from the top of your tricep right down to somewhere else on your body. In fact, many animals have been recovered in the world after being lost, and they can't find their implant because it's traveled through the skin and transdermal layer of the skin. 3 Square Market, more implanting. I Got Chipped, more gimmicks. You know, for vending machines. 3 Square Market was a vending machine company. We then went to multi-application through your implant. Why just use it for vending or for payment or for Verimed? You can use it for passports. You can use it for your keys to turn on your car. You can use it for your front door access, your worker access, your access to your computer, your access to your mobile phone, right? So we're starting to diversify here with IoT. And now currently in some small case studies, although I will say to you, we're talking now in the thousands, SG Rail, public rail service does allow for people, VIP customers, to top up their implant with money to pay for their fare. and that is now in the thousands. But it's not like 1 million people tomorrow will take this. But what we're seeing is perhaps companies that are coming to talk about this. So DangerousThings.com has been around since 2009. We believe biohacking is the next phase of human evolution, a bit like the human metaphor that we read about at Anderson Consulting. The Internet of Us is Biohacks International, a very famous company that does a lot of the microchipping parties in Sweden. Biotech, another human re-engineering company that really looks at implantables, like book your implant, buy online. Chip My Life, an Australian company from Glebe, run by Steve Stevens and his wife. Biohacking and BioWorld, who are looking at supporting people in wheelchairs so that they are able to be more mobile through the use of implantables, for example, to open their front door. And so we're seeing this overlay of surveillance, of technology speak, of actual product, the actual medical device and how well it works and how it's implanted and how people feel about it and in the future. But what inspired all of this? Where did these ideas at Anderson come from? A very interesting executive, perhaps, a young intern, who and why? And so we go back with Michael very often to science fiction. And here we have Casino Royale from 2006, where James receives an implant device and allows him to be, in some parts, superhuman. We go back to The Entire History of You, a Black Mirror episode from 2011, where the implant is behind the head in what's called the grain. And the grain allows you to see through your eyes and replay events that have happened in the past. We can go back even to Johnny Mnemonic in 1995 with this thing on his head and this transference, this implant scene of how this memory is downloaded to Johnny. We can even go to The Surrogates with Bruce Willis and look at the brain puppeteers. Or we can go frightening back to George Lucas with THX 1138. But look at this picture here with THX 1138.
38, yeah.
And then look at the next slide with the Neuralink. That's how far we've come. We were just talking about implants for the body for the greater part of this talk, but now we're actually transferring through the brain. What about the Neuralink? What about the brain implant? And what's that about? I think I'll probably say maybe it's about, a lot to do with the mind, but really no one will ever know what you're thinking. They may know how the synapses are firing between locations in the brain, but they won't know your thoughts. So with that, I've gone on too long, but there is plenty of time, and I'd like to pass on to Critiquing Überveillance for a different lens by Dr. Roba Abbas.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay.
Thank you, Katina and MG Michael, and thank you to the wonderful Joseph Carvalko and the Yale Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics for hosting us today. Thank you. Next slide, Katina. Before providing a commentary on the evolution of Überveillance as a definition, so I'm going to backtrack a bit back to where we started with MG Michael. I'll commence this critique by referring to or referencing a taxonomy and comparison of the different forms of valence to really situate this critique. And these forms of valence were articulated so well by MG Michael in his introductory remarks, and they've been documented well in various publications, such as the article that you see on your screen, and I think this is a helpful starting point in the critique. So this article represents the evolution of the different gazes that are expressed in the literature. That is that shift that MG Michael mentioned from the above, surveillance, to the below, which is surveillance, and then the within, Überveillance, and really provides the foundations for our taxonomy and a critique, whereby Überveillance can be perceived as the merging of all of these gazes. On the next slide, you can see that specifically we'll be drawing here on the work from 2012, in which Überveillance was by this time an established term situated alongside other forms of valence, as Katina mentioned in her historical account and journey around the term. So notably, we're looking at surveillance, data valence, and surveillance. So the comparison that is provided on this slide was in the context of a study around the so the social subsystem, as it's referred to, which is derived from a socio-technical theorization, whereby the different types of valence and monitoring systems were explored in terms of their implications specifically on the theme of control, as mentioned by MG Michael as an underlying factor in his introductory remarks. So the table presented here compares the different features of surveillance, dataveillance, surveillance, and Überveillance, as summarized in 2012 in my doctoral thesis, which was centered on determining the need for location-based services regulation, and also in a subsequent article published with MG Michael and Katina Michael that's referenced on the slide in the International Review of Information Ethics. So I'll briefly spend a moment on summarizing and comparing each of these concepts, pointing to the important distinctions as we move towards the definition and main characteristics of Überveillance as represented in the literature. So I'll be reiterating some of the points covered by MG and Katina, but really emphasizing the main elements and characteristics from a comparative perspective. So surveillance is concerned with the process of methodically monitoring through various means and based on the collection of information about behaviors, actions, and so on that are related to an individual or individuals. And it's important to point that this tends to be a targeted and routine process or action in nature, utilizing primarily visual monitoring systems with an emphasis on first-hand observation and images. And a distinction has been made in the literature by Professor Roger Clark, between the personal and mass surveillance practices. In surveillance studies, a range of metaphors have been utilized to explore and understand surveillance, and a prevalent metaphor is that of the panopticon, which was first introduced by Bentham in 1843 and later by Foucault in 1977. So if we move to this somewhat superseding notion of data surveillance, which, as MG Michael mentioned, is commonly referred to as dataveillance. This term was coined in the mid-80s, and it extends the notion of surveillance to focus on the organized and regular use of, as MG mentioned, personal data systems for monitoring purposes based on an automated process or processes in which data trails of individuals are collected. The emphasis here is on data or aggregated data and information, as opposed to your traditional forms of surveillance that comparatively rely on extensive or expensive visual monitoring techniques. Next, we have the term surveillance, which was coined by Steve Mann and originates from the French term sous, which means from below, and when combined with veiller, denotes to watch from below. So as MG Michael mentioned, Steve Mann refers to this as somewhat of inverse surveillance or surveilling the surveillors. This type of veillance makes use of wearable computing devices and technologies to capture audio, visual, and sensory data, and may include images of locations and corresponding geographic coordinates. And lastly, in terms of situating this critique, we have Überveillance, which combines the dimensions of identification, location, and time, potentially allowing for forecasting and uninterrupted real-time monitoring, which was documented by Katina and MG Michael in 2007. So in the earlier definitions that MG Michael and Katina have utilized, this has been likened to Big Brother on the inside looking out. And at the time of the publications that are cited on this screen below the table, Überveillance was considered by several authors to be that contemporary notion that was to supplant surveillance as a term, primarily through the extension of the notion of dataveillance. So on the next slide, we can look to recent literature that's taken the initial taxonomy and built on this taxonomy and provided further extensions. But without elaborating too much here, I think I'll shift to the critique of the evolution of the concept itself from when it was originally coined to the present day. So on the next screen, thank you, Katina. Let's revisit MG Michael's original definition. Sorry, Katina, the next screen, please. So MG Michael's original definition, as was stated earlier, is an above and beyond omnipresent 24 surveillance where the explicit concerns for misinformation, misrepresentation, and information manipulation are ever more multiplied, and where potentially the technology is embedded within our body. In this definition, I'd like to point to the amplified levels of surveillance that are continuous in nature by that 24/7 reference, and also the embedded element, which features in this early definition. So soon after this definition in 2007, Roger Clark was invited to give a keynote presentation in those pictures that Katina showed earlier, in which he provided 3 interpretations of überveillance. The first one was around an exaggerated form of surveillance, which is really about the increase of the scope and extent of surveillance, considering concepts such as the how, where, and what dimensions and extensions to their scope. The second interpretation was around master surveillance, which really underscores the Uber prefix to imply the meta, supra, or master surveillance aspect, and a view of surveillance whereby multiple sources are utilized in the provision of somewhat of a holistic, in inverted commas, picture comprised of superior or made up of superior information collection capabilities. And Roger Clark's last interpretation was around this notion of Omni Surveillance, which is really that apocalyptic view that MG Michael referred to, and that dystopian perspective that highlighting all aspects of surveillance across, or the all aspect, of surveillance, so across all space, all time, and the all-seeing and all-knowing elements. Now, if we move to the next slide, to an evolution of these earlier definitions and interpretations in the literature, we can demonstrate in this evolution a shift from focus on purely embedded technologies to the consistent, persistent, and pervasive aspects and characteristics. So the implications of überveillance on civil liberties stressed in the work of Palmer and colleagues, and elements of that inescapable gaze are discussed and emphasized. Another, evolution on the next slide, we witness yet another progression in the definition of überveillance, this time moving beyond a human-centric view to the non-human, so to things such as animals, to products, to transactions, and to our value and supply chains. And I think it's really important at this point to draw out and point to an aspect that MG Michael spoke about in his talk earlier about the elasticity of the term. So the term is quite malleable, and as a result may be applied in both a narrow or from a narrow perspective, and also in a broad sense. Narrow really signifying only the embedded devices in a human's view, and the broad sense signaling a shift in terms of encompassing the non-human entities that I mentioned, so animals, products, transactions, and so on. And I think a new form of veillance is signaled in this respect. It is reliant on multiple sources rather than just the embedded devices, multiple sources, and a somewhat amplified form of surveillance and data veillance also. So this elasticity also means that überveillance can be applied across a range of application areas. But before I briefly discuss the application areas, I'll be as brief as possible to leave some time for some questions. Let's review a number of prominent references that I think are important in terms of this critique. On the next slide, the first reference points to the invited keynote delivered by Professor Roger Clark, in which I spoke about the interpretations. And this was delivered at the second RNSA workshop on the social implications of national security in 2006, and was later revised for publication in the IEEE Technology and Society magazine in 2010. In this particular reference, Clark articulates a range of interpretations, as mentioned, including that evolution aspect in those 3 perspectives, so the exaggerated, the master, and the omni surveillance. And he continues to pose a range of counterveillance principles in response to the potential perils relating to the various interpretations of überveillance and indeed surveillance. These include, but are not limited to, which I think still hold true today, the significance of independent evaluation of emerging technologies, consultation and participation, which is quite a dominant theme at the moment in terms of co-design and participatory approaches, and also the selection of a suitable design or suitable design principles when considering this notion of überveillance. And these counterveillance measures certainly apply today. On the next slide, and in this second reference to Überveillance that was chosen to highlight here, the concept is discussed from a philosophical perspective by Professor Raphael Capurro in the context of Society 5.0. So Society 5.0 really moves beyond the Society 1.0's focus on the hunter-gatherer approach, beyond Society 2.0, which emphasizes agriculture, Society 3.0, which is characterized by industrialization, and Society 4.0, which is around information and the information age, to promoting a human-centered, super smart Society 5.0. So this society really symbolizes a complex cyber-physical ecosystem that supersedes the fourth industrial revolution even, and as such is predicted to be more transformative in nature. In terms of Professor Capurro's work, the link to Überveillance is somewhat cautionary in that it promotes questioning of computer power as we approach this Society 5.0 in order to avoid becoming an Überveillance society and to avoid some of those consequences that Katina and MG alluded to in their talks. The third reference, or this next source, is a report produced by the NSI team for the US Department of Homeland Security and for the Department of Defense, in which the security and defense related challenges stemming from emerging and disruptive technologies are considered. So there's a call for critical and disruptive thinking to explore the role, potential, and the perils or challenges of technological advancements from a government perspective, providing guidance to stakeholders such as intelligence agencies, law enforcement personnel, the military and policy agencies. And Überveillance is referenced in this particular report with respect to cybersecurity and hacking, notably the planetary scale RFID services in an Age of Überveillance article that was published by Katina and a number of colleagues in 2010. And this final reference that we're highlighting here is by the Netherlands government, centered on data and digital technology in public spaces and the related issues of data ownership, control, and social values. So Überveillance is addressed in this report from an ethical viewpoint, in which the authors propose, again, a participatory design approach to counter some of these identified challenges, or the identified challenges, which relate really to a government-based view of Überveillance, whereby a range of monitoring techniques or monitoring sources are employed in public spaces, potentially resulting in misinformation, misrepresentation, and manipulation as per earlier definitions of Überveillance. And the report furthermore highlights the value that Dutch citizens place on privacy. So that includes information privacy, social communicative privacy, psychological privacy, and informational privacy. And just one element that I think I'll point out here is the claim that's made that in an Überveillance society, privacy will be compromised at various levels, considering those different types of privacy that I just identified. And I'll probably, just to leave some time for question, end with this slide and not emphasize too much the points, but with these range of demonstrative and prominent references, just to summarize, it's clear that Überveillance has morphed as a concept and can be applied in a variety and a range of situations and contexts, and in different ways. Some examples include in forensics, in nursing, sports, in government, healthcare, and much, much more, such as architecture, for instance, and other areas, which I can't delve too deeply into just in the interest of time here. So as the use of this term intensifies, discussions around information access will become increasingly important. And this is represented by the concept of access defined by MG Michael, which Katina will hopefully be able to describe in the concluding remarks here. Thank you, Katina. Over to you.
Thanks, Roba. You know, we couldn't do what you just did. It takes another pair of eyes, but also someone who's followed the work for a very long time since its inception. But can I just say that was just beautiful, clinical, and very reflective, and actually helped me to see certain things that have come out in our work. But you have been there from the very beginning, and so we appreciate you so much. So much, Roba. In our concluding remarks, just to summarize, I mean, I remember where we were when we were brainstorming this diagram, and Roba had just begun her PhD. We were outside my office from memory, and we said, what just clicked there? What just happened? And we drew these concentric circles because I was trying to show you the different views or share them together. And this is what came out. You've got the satellites up in space. You've got different kinds of systems, you know, bolted onto buildings. You've got street views on the ground with cars driving around taking photographs like Google Street View cars. You've got person view systems like Google Glass or the iTap device of Steve Mann. And then you've got the embedded devices, the sensor view. And all of these are like a concertina. You can start at the middle and lift that middle piece up and then come down. And we started to think about hierarchical positioning systems, like, given my networks background. But then Michael started to place a lens of philosophical thoughts on top, as did Christine Paraxlis in a later iteration of this diagram for MIT Press, where she talks about borders of surveillance and borders of privacy. But if we look at the implantable in its strictest context, we now have maybe a medical device like this St. Jude defibrillator, and it's in the body. What can it do? What can it tell us? Well, it can give us a lot of information. Maybe it can give us an ECG reading. Maybe it can report back that the person's heart is beating quite well. But it also streams a lot of data out of it, right? You go to rest in the evening by your bedside and information is taken from the device and uploaded back to base. In fact, it doesn't go to you as the user, as the bearer of the technology. It goes back to base. It goes back to the manufacturer. The manufacturer is more interested in faults, in fault tolerance, in exceptions, in red flags, in its continuous use, in any activity that has occurred that should be detected. And here we are. Here's the embedded device. A lot of people now in the world are bearing these. In fact, the NIH says that 10% of Americans are bearing some kind of implantable device. Not all of them are digital, but 10% of Americans, and that number will only increase as our lifespan increases. But there was a case in January 30th of 2017 where the police used pacemaker data to charge a homeowner with arson. A man, 54, 55 years of age, had attempted to put his house on fire. He succeeded. And what actually happened was that he had gasoline on his shoes and on his clothes. When the officer went to visit the lieutenant, he smelt on the man's clothing and thought, how did this man, who's, you know, looks quite slow and large, how did he move 4 sort of large bags out of the house with his belongings? So the information was subpoenaed from the pacemaker device. A cardiologist, a specialist, actually looked at the contents of the ECG that had emanated from the device, made an assessment on the person's health, and said this man could not have rushed in a panic to take 4 bags outside the house. He was the first person who was, if I can say, snitched on in the American way, snitched on by his pacemaker device. And that was really the first full-blown case of Überveillance, where the implantable allows for the dissemination of data that actually incriminates as evidence. It's evidence, right? So today we take Opal cards or tap and go cards for transportation. The transport network knows whether we're traveling north or south. It actually even knows our speed between stations because all of this is time-stamped, and you're on a train, for example, that's going through different signal stations. But what if the new devices we start to acquire and start to implant and start to bear and wear as body area networks begin to actually leave trails of not only identity chronicles, not only location chronicles, not only condition chronicles, but even towards the thought of context, where we are saying, because we know all of this information, we can predict what you're thinking. And so MG Michael calls this the axis of access, as Roba said. And it's about the capability of the implantable, but also who has the right to access. As me, the end user, who has the device embedded in their body, I don't have the right to access. In fact, Medtronic have even barred people who have a implantable diabetic device. They have told those people that they can't have access. So many of them have hacked into older Medtronic devices through programmers and started to create apps for themselves to monitor their health better. And so the patient, rather than being right at the top of the axis of the accessibility of one's data that emanates from one's body, from the device that one is bearing, is at the lowest end of the spectrum. And yet, as we go up the scale, we can see that the police with a warrant have greater access to your implantable than you do. The specialist interpreter, like the cardiologist, the manufacturer who has built the device and talks about something called the right to switch off. We saw this with Google Glass. If you were one of the 1,800 people or so who had a Google Glass, the company actually had a terms and conditions that said we have the right to switch off remotely. Well, will manufacturers or suppliers of different embeddables or wearables or devices that we require and start to need to exist, like we need the mobile phone to exist, but what if they have the right to switch off remotely? And so the hackers have the access, the manufacturers, the secret intelligence organizations, but the poor old humble end user is locked out. And so that's a bit of the moment we want to leave you with here is how will we go to what's called near real-time or real-time prediction? What does it mean as we're building this infrastructure, this web beyond social media? Imagine social media within. Imagine multimodal biometrics, the DNA stored within on the implant. Imagine a highly encrypted implant, which many resellers are selling now, and basically saying, why aren't we implanting everyone at birth? And I leave you with tying this to COVID. I'm not saying to you tomorrow there will be implants for COVID. In fact, I don't believe that personally. What I do believe in is a trajectory towards contactless and frictionless. And in a talk I gave recently to the Phoenix mobile community, I said, we will certainly have contactless. We will not have frictionless. Contactless doesn't always mean frictionless. You just have to ask a group of elderly people who are trying to use a QR code to scan in to visit a retail store to eat a sandwich or have a coffee, that holding their hand for 30 seconds straight is not possible when this QR code is high above to scan. But what if the next iteration of this data, check in, check out, tell us where you're going. We really need you to be vaccinated to get on a Qantas plane. We really need you to have a device that requires, okay, maybe this is the future. But the question will be at what price? As Roba's last point was, this notion back to the Netherlands report you were reading, Roba, at what price? At what price of privacy? And at what cost? And so in our bid to say that technology will be the answer and the solution to our woes, quite possibly we may be finding ourselves enslaved in a point of no return. That's where I think we'll leave it. And thank you so much for your patience. We've talked for such a long time.
No, I thank you all for a wonderful presentation. I think we certainly, I, who am somewhat steeped in all of this, was fascinated by the elucidation of the trajectory. And I'm always sort of fascinated by the trajectory because that's one way we, I think, get to see the future.